Jesus mentioned the word tithe twice in the narratives of the gospel. Now the question is, what was he trying to communicate in these specific passages? Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. These you ought to have done, without leaving others undone. Now in this verse, Jesus was speaking to the scribes and the Pharisees and called them hypocrites because they paid tithes but neglected the weightier matters of the law. Now in fact, he clearly stated that the practice of tithing was not the most important part of the law. He invited them to practice first justice, mercy and faith, because without those things, it is impossible to please God. The Pharisees were particularly zealous for the traditions of their fathers and were among the most religious Jews. The word Pharisee means separated. They called themselves separated because they stood away from the things and the people they considered impure. Now, these set apart so-called men thought that righteousness was obtained by the strict applications of the law as illustrated in the following passage. Also, he spoke this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself, God, I thank you that I am not like the other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I possess. And the tax collector, standing afar off, would not even so much as to raise his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, the man went down to his house justified rather than the other, for everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. Luke chapter 18, verse 9 to 14. Now, through this story, Jesus describes the attitude of two men, a Pharisee and a tax collector, who went to the temple to pray. And the Pharisee exalted his righteousness and considered himself faithful to God's law because he was not committing the tax collector's sins regularly because he fasted and gave a tenth of all that he had. And the tax collector, on the other hand, humbly admitted to being a sinner before God and implored his mercy. Now, in the end, the repentant tax collector was justified rather than the arrogant Pharisee. Now, the central teaching of this parable is that there is no justification for the strict observation of the law. Indeed, God takes more pleasure in humility and brokenness, as in Psalms 51. Jesus did talk about tithing as shown in this passage, but these verses cannot be quoted in our day to encourage Christians to tithe because it was not the intentional message of this passage. Although Jesus did not condemn tithing here, we must understand that when he spoke in Matthew 23:23 and Luke 11:42, which tells the same story, Jesus was still under the old covenant as the new covenant began with his death and resurrection.